What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. Today we're going to switch things up with a book review of my most anticipated book of 2025, The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. And not to worry, I'll be going spoiler-free initially. The first 12 chapters are already available online, and the book's already out in the UK. It came out yesterday, but it doesn't come out in the US until Tuesday, I think May 13th. Is that what Tuesday is? In any case, ordinarily I would be proudly displaying a physical copy of the book in my hands, but I don't have one. I'm waiting for it through Amazon. But I was so excited about this book for the first time ever. I actually reached out to the publisher, Tor Books, and I was like, I'm a Joe Abercrombie freak. I've got to review this book. I've got to read this book. And after a little bit of pestering and poking at them for a good long while, they did give me a digital galley for the book. I don't even really know if I'm using the term galley correctly. My older brother and my sister-in-law work in publishing. They'd be horrified. They gave me a review copy of the book. But as you can tell from this bookshelf up here, I love Joe Abercrombie's books. I read his First Law series eagerly and with relish. It is one of my favorite series of books that I've ever read. It is an excellent fantasy series, and I can remember feeling absolute horror when I saw a lot of people skipping the middle three books, Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country, because they were under the mistaken impression that because those are standalone books, they weren't important to the overall story. So I saw some reviewers reading the first trilogy and the final trilogy, and for my money, the best three books in the series are Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country. They absolutely blew my mind, and they are recurring characters in all 9 books, so you have to read the whole thing from start to finish, as well as the collection of short stories, Sharp Ends, which I highly recommend. And it is my genuine, sincere hope that Joe Abercrombie will return to the First Law series at a certain point, because the 9th book did end with a bit of a cliffhanger, but he's cleansing his palate. He's switching gears with this new series. And let me go ahead and give you the official synopsis from Goodreads. So The Devils is a brand new epic fantasy from New York Times bestselling author Joe Abercrombie, featuring a notorious band of anti-heroes on a delightfully bloody and raucous journey. Holy work sometimes requires unholy deeds. Brother Diaz has been summoned to the sacred city, where he is certain a commendation and grand holy assignment awaits him. But his new flock is made up of unrepentant murderers, practitioners of ghastly magic, and outright monsters. The mission he is tasked with will require bloody measures from them all in order to achieve its righteous ends. Elves lurk at our borders and hunger for our flesh, while greedy princes care for nothing but their own ambitions and comfort. With a hellish journey before him, it's a good thing Brother Diaz has the devils on his side. And that more or less gets the job done when it comes to teeing up the story and potentially getting people interested. But as far as my reaction goes, my spoiler-free review goes for, once again, my most anticipated book of 2025, I really enjoyed it, but it is not on the level of my favorite book by Joe Abercrombie, The Heroes. The Heroes for me is peak Joe Abercrombie, where all of his characters and all of his storylines and all of his setting, it all comes together for a story that's a little bit like the Battle of Gettysburg, but in a fantasy setting. It's just absolutely astonishing. Or some might compare it to the movie A Bridge Too Far. It's awesome. And the reason I say Battle of Gettysburg is because of the book The Killer Angels. The book The Killer Angels and the book Heroes have a lot in common. That, for me, is peak Joe Abercrombie. But The Devils is definitely not at the bottom of the pile either. Maybe a fair comparison would be to Best Served Cold, where you have a band of ne'er-do-wells, in some cases outright murderers and monsters, on a mission. The mission is very different, because Best Served Cold is a revenge story, whereas The Devils is a story. Once again, I don't even know really what a spoiler is. Whenever I see reviews for books, it seems like my definition of a spoiler is don't tell people the major plot twist and how it ends, where you can get into the details of the setting and the plot. But other people tend to, they give such spoiler-free reviews that you suspect that maybe they haven't even read the book, where it's so bland and so general, they're not really saying anything. So all I can really say is The Devils is a good fantasy book. It is an excellent intro to a new series. I will eagerly read the second book. But if you are a Joe Abercrombie fanatic, you probably don't even need a review before pulling the trigger and buying the book. You probably pre-ordered the book a year ago, like I did, because I've been eagerly anticipating The Devils for a long time, and I've been wondering, what is this new series that Joe Abercrombie is going to introduce that's going to interrupt his storyline in First Law, which remains unfinished. But I can be patient, and I can totally hang with these characters for the foreseeable future. But what I can say without giving away any spoilers is that the tone of the Devils, or the overall style of the adventure, is quite different from the first Lost series. The first Lost series was considerably more grim and bleak in terms of the setting and some of the characters. Like, they're still complete and total bastards, all scattered throughout the story of the Devils, but it's a much more fast-paced adventure story where it's like, here are our heroes or anti-heroes. This is the team. Here's the first combat scene. Here's their daring escape. Here's the next big encounter. Here's the next daring escape. It's like, it's structured in a lot of ways like the world's most expensive TV show, where every single episode is going to end with the most kick-ass battle that you've ever seen. Some of those battles which will probably extend over several episodes. I guess that might qualify as both criticism and praise, because the book in a lot of ways does feel like the world's greatest pitch for a TV show ever written. I'm much more of a movie guy than a TV guy, but you could easily see The Devils being adapted into an animated series, something like The Legend of Vox Machina. Or if they did it as live action, it would be killer, but goddamn, it would be expensive. The Devils has empires and monsters and one of the coolest magic systems that I've come across in a long time in the fantasy genre. It would not be an easy project to get underway unless you did it as animation. But as I was reading the book, I was like, this is gloriously entertaining. It's so fast-paced. The characters are so likable, and the action is absolutely thrilling. But I wouldn't have minded if the book had slowed down a bit and given us a little bit more meat on the bone. I'm one of those nerds where I never get tired of looking at maps of worlds that don't exist or reading histories of worlds that will never exist. Like, it's just my nerdy side, and perhaps I developed that by reading too much Tolkien as a young fella. But I love a fantasy series where I'm just craving to know all the information that's out there about the history and the setting, and I want to know the whole world. But with the Devils, the world it's got some overlap with ours, because this is a medieval fantasy version of Europe, where imagine Europe 1,000 years ago if every single devil or demon or witch or magician or myth that had ever existed anywhere in Europe, if they were all true. Because this is a world where you can actually summon a devil to do your bidding. This is a world where you might bump into an angel that might place a binding upon you. This is a world where necromancers and pyromancers do battle. But what's interesting is how, while it is similar to our world in terms of the geography, a lot of the myths and stories and history are kind of turned upside down in terms of which empires won which wars, or which religions have certain values. And so it's like a twisted mirror image to our world. But after a certain point, you kind of forget that it's supposed to be Europe altogether, because the fantasy story is that immersive. But as you're reading the story, somebody will make a reference to a popular Greek myth from our culture, which for them is just history, but the outcome of the myth will be reversed or upside down. So it's both familiar and unfamiliar all at once, as is this version of Europe, because you can't trust your knowledge of history in terms of who were the victors in certain struggles. So it makes it a little bit easier to get over the hump of getting invested in this world. Like, the reverse of that would be a series like Malazan Book of the Fallen, where I've only read the first 3 books, and I loved it, and I was blown away by it, but it was so dense and so impenetrable, and it was so rich with information, it kind of surpassed even my appetite for getting immersed in a new world, where I was spending more time skipping to the appendices or looking at glossaries than I was actually reading the story. You can dive right into the Devils. Tired, exhausted, falling asleep in bed. It's easy reading, and it's also, like I said before, very, very fast reading. And for this book, I did something which I've never done before. On 2 occasions while I was reading it, I went to a cigar bar in the West Village, Hudson Bar and Books, which is kind of a mix of library and bar and like James Bond shrine. But I would smoke cigars while reading the book. And I never knew this, and this is not an endorsement to give yourself a heart attack with too much nicotine. But if you're reading a book while reading a cigar, you get so into it. The nicotine is so intense that the book is like, it starts to feel like it was written in lightning bolts. But obviously, that all falls on the shoulders. That's all due to the extraordinary talents of Joe Abercrombie, who I would not rank him amongst the elite of the elite when it comes to fantasy authors, but he's certainly one of the most prolific and reliable. Like, which do you want? Do you want a writer who's astonishing but writes 1 book every 10 years, if that? Or do you want a writer that you can rely upon to write, 10 or 11 books over like a 15-year period? There's a case to be made that the steady, reliable professional is a much more favorable outcome for fantasy nerds like myself. And I have to say that between this book and the new game Clair Obscura Expedition 33, 2025 is turning into a really cool year for the fantasy genre. I just saw in the news today that Alex Garland is working with A24 to try to bring Elden Ring to the screen. I'm like, all right, like fantasy, like maybe 6-7 years ago, went through this renaissance in TV where a bunch of shows got the green light and nearly all of them turned out to be terrible or started strong and became terrible. And I don't want to sully this review by talking about the shortcomings of shows like Willow or What the Witcher turned out to be or The Wheel of Time or The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. I guess I just did. In any case, if you're a fantasy fan, at least books and video games continue to be incredibly reliable. And Joe Abercrombie is a huge part of that just because I've read all of his books over like the last 5 or 6 years. So it seems like to me the fantasy genre is thriving, but some people might say that the fantasy genre is starting to get a little stale. But I think for anybody who thinks that the fantasy genre is oversaturated, well, it's always been oversaturated. For like ever since I was a kid, you go into like a Walden Books or whatever, and the fantasy section was always like, oh my God, like never in 100 lifetimes could I read all these goddamn fantasy books. But I still have a lot of fantasy books on my to-do list that I want to read. But Joe Abercrombie, anytime he publishes a book, I will clear my schedule and make reading that book my highest priority. And I know I'm not alone in terms of being a happy fan, because anytime I mention the fantasy genre on this channel in any way, shape, or form, I get bombarded with recommendations in the comments. Like there are legions of diehard fantasy fans out there. So before anybody recommends the following 2 books, they are on my to-do list. Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. I've been itching to get into John Gwynne for a long time. And Empire of Silence, which is part of the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rocchio. I don't know how he pronounces his last name. Those 2 books keep coming up in the comment section, so I will read them. So if you're already busily typing, have you read those yet? The answer is no. I've been busy reading some other stuff, but my interest in the fantasy genre remains alive and well. But getting back to the Devils, and once again, spoiler free, while I might prefer the darker side or the more kind of somber side of Joe Abercrombie, there's something to be said for a book that makes you laugh out loud frequently and often, and I was constantly cracking up while reading The Devils. And oftentimes in unexpected ways. There's a lot of the stories written in the style of like a dirty joke, or like the kind of dirty jokes that you might expect from soldiers who are always going from one campaign to the next without ever stopping. They would just, as a way of just kind of alleviating the boredom and the monotony of constantly, having people trying to kill you, they just talk about drinking and screwing and smoking and all the regular vices in a very frank, candid way. And yeah, it's a kind of a saucy book at times. And some of the sexual humor, I had a digital copy, but I had to put down the iPad and like hold my belly as I was cracking up. There's a character, I don't know if this is a spoiler or not, but there's a character just by the name, I'll use the word Viga. I won't tell you if that's a first name, last name, or just a title or description, but a character that you will come to know as Viga that had me laughing uproariously, pretty much from start to finish, even though their story has a lot of bittersweet, sad ingredients as well. But with every potentially great fantasy series, there's always a scene early on where it kind of grabs you, and you know that whether the book's 500 pages, 5,000 pages, like wherever the series goes, you're going to follow it. And for me, that moment happens about 1/10 of the way through this book, where I started highlighting passages, highlighting lines of dialogue. I was highlighting like a madman. But there's a scene where it seems like everything is, like all hope is lost and that the characters are totally fucked. And then it turns into one of the most glorious action scenes that I've ever read in the fantasy genre. You could even argue that it's kind of within the horror genre as well, because there's certain supernatural horror archetypes that are used very prominently in this story, whether you're talking about vampires or werewolves or necromancers or different creatures with different abilities that seem familiar from other stories in the past, but they all have a very fresh new coat of paint in the story. But I was relieved to have that moment come early on where I was like, all right, I love these characters, I love the story, let's fucking go. And from that point onward, the pace of the story never lets up. I mean, I kept wanting to say to Joe, like, you've got 700 pages, like, slow down, buddy. Like, we've got all the time in the world, but it's just like, boom, 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 one encounter after another. But if I were to offer a criticism of the book, without saying what, where, or how, at about the halfway point of the book, something major happens that kind of changes the format or the overall structure of the story. And it takes a little while for the book to kind of find its footing again. And I was still loving the characters, and I was still loving the dialogue, and I was loving all the violent encounters. It was still great, but it wasn't like, like there are certain times where you're so addicted to a book that like you just kind of have it on your person at all times. Like you can't bear to be deprived of it. That went away from about the 1/2 mark up to about the 2/3 mark, and then it comes roaring back, and the book really sticks the landing in incredibly satisfying fashion, where if you start to feel doubtful or skeptical that Joe Abercrombie is going to be able to kind of rein in a story, and that oftentimes is a big problem. As your world grows and as your number of characters grows, sometimes it becomes unwieldy. We've seen that with George R. R. Martin, where he's got too many different characters, and it's like, just kill some of them and simplify your story, make your life easier. But yeah, I don't think we're ever going to see The Wind's a Winner. It's been 14 years since the last book came out. But Joe Abercrombie will continue to write more books. So George R. R. Martin, we love you, but I do like the productivity of Joe Abercrombie. But getting back to the ending of The Devils, you could make a case for like the final 6th or whatever. I mean, being very vague or broad with some of my numbers, but it's probably the best part of the book because it does introduce a little bit of darkness and tragedy that for me had been missing and noticeably missing throughout most of the book. While it is fun to follow a bunch of psychopaths and ne'er-do-wells and evil creatures kind of on a holy mission doing terrible things, it's so lighthearted and so fast-paced that sometimes the stakes didn't feel as pronounced as in some of the other Joe Abercrombie books, where I wasn't as invested or worried just because the characters seem to be having so much fun. And if the characters are having a ton of fun, you're not really worried about anybody killing them. Toward the end of the book, so I'm like, oh, wow, okay. Now things that are horrible can happen to these characters that I love. And what it did in hindsight, it made all the earlier lighthearted adventures all the more special by comparison, where I was like, all right, now I kind of see all those adventures in a different light because I'm realizing these are brief shining moments during these adventures, but like the way these adventures begin and end for these characters is not all that fun for the characters involved. And so I think upon a reread, I probably would embrace the lighthearted aspect much more, knowing where this story ultimately is going to go. And I'm making it sound like at the end of the book it's like this big, dark, grim, morbid experience. It's still an absolute blast. It's just a blast with stakes, and you need some stakes if you want the reader to care about the ultimate fate of your characters. So in conclusion, from my spoiler-free section, I'll just say this is by no means the first fantasy book that features a team of people that kind of bicker and fight and fall in love while they're on an epic adventure to accomplish a big goal. I mean, people have been using that format over and over and over again, probably since the dawn of time, and will continue to do so until the end of time. It's a great format. Get between 5 and 9 characters together, all of whom have different skills, send them on a quest, and see what happens. Yeah, that shit never gets old, but the question is, like, what variations on a familiar theme can you include in your story? What fresh coat of paint can you include in your fantasy setting? A genre that is, once again, a little oversaturated, but I always remain open to, and I'm on the hunt for, great fantasy experiences. If I could spend every day of my life for the rest of my life just enjoying dark adult fantasy, I probably would. Like, I love Westerns and history and all kinds of other stories, but I'm just a lifelong fantasy nerd, and The Devils absolutely scratched that itch. Is it on the level that I hoped it would be for the last few years while I was eagerly awaiting the publication of the book? No, it's not. Like I said before, it's not on the level of the heroes. But what is my least favorite Joe Abercrombie book? I liked his most recent trilogy of A Little Hatred, The Trouble with Peace, and The Wisdom of Crowds. I did not like that trilogy as much as the previous 2 trilogies. I would say The Devils is more enjoyable than the most recent trilogy of books in the First Law series. Not on the level of the Central trilogy, which is my favorite Joe Abercrombie, period. And I'd say, The Devils is probably right on the level of his first 3 books. The Blade itself, Before They're Hanged, Last Argument of Kings. A little bit different in tone and style, but equally compelling, equally addictive. And like I said before, I'm dying to see whatever book he's got cooking in the oven to continue the story moving forward. But I think I've gone as far as I can go without offering some specifics. And I do want to offer at least a few specifics because these are the aspects that I really enjoyed. But I know that some corners of the internet will regard this as a spoiler. But once again, first 12 chapters of the book are already available online. The book is out in the UK. I'm sure that there are forums already where people are eagerly discussing how this book unfolds, so I don't feel too guilty having a spoiler-light section. But bail out now if you don't want any reveals of any kind. But we got to talk about the characters, because the characters, in the end, I like the adventure, I like the setting, I like the action, but I loved the characters because it's such an interesting mix of classic archetypes. It almost sounds like an old dad joke for if old dads really like the fantasy genre. Like people say, like, oh, like, you know, like a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim walk into a bar and yada, yada, yada. Like they have those kind of old-fashioned dad jokes. But in the case of the Devils, the team that's being assembled has some very classic supernatural horror archetypes as well as some great fantasy archetypes that come together, and they all have to rely upon one another to survive. So in no particular order in terms of preference or how they're introduced, you have Brother Diaz, the humble priest. Once again, how much can I give away? Well, let's just say that the religion of this period has a lot in common with Christianity roughly 1,000 years ago, but there's been a great schism where you got the Western Church and the Eastern Church. And in one church you have all women, and in one church you have all men, and one worships a circle and one worships a wheel. They don't quite agree on when Easter is, but they hate each other, but they're basically the same thing, and they need to find a way to come back together and have a unified front, because one day elves will emerge from the Holy Lands and basically eat everybody. And if Europe remains divided at that point, they will lose that war. And as a part of kind of, I guess, solidifying their ranks, they have to put this unassuming little like beggar girl on the throne in Troy because she's the rightful heir, but she was lost a long time ago. But if they can get her back on the throne and help like basically solidify their base within the upcoming war with the elves, might have a more favorable outcome. So the group that's designed to bring this girl back to Troy and put her back on the throne includes Brother Diaz, who's awesome. I mean, initially he's just your classic kind of nerdy priest, but over the course of the story really blooms and emerges as really one of the most interesting heroes in the story. You also have Alex, who is the princess beggar. And I would say that the archetype of the foul-mouthed, like kind of like street rat who actually is destined for greatness, maybe that's been a little overplayed, or maybe it's just because it's kind of familiar from Empire of the Vampire and Empire of the Damned, which I just read recently, which I love, but it has a very, very similar character at the core of that story as well, so I might be a little tired of that kind of story. But we have Baptiste, who's kind of the jack of all trades and master of none. She's posed nude for artists, and she's basically every job or like every occupation you could possibly have in medieval Europe. She's had them at one point or another, whether it's lockpicking or working as a pirate or whatever the case may be. You've got Jacob of Thorn. How much can I say about him? Let's just say that he's got a lot of blood on his hands, and he's taken a lot of vows to do the right thing for the church as a way of kind of cleaning his conscience. But he's old, and he's miserable, and he's racked with injuries and pain and agony. But he's also probably the world's greatest living soldier or tactician when it comes to how do you win a battle in ruthless fashion. And he's an incredible character as well. Definitely one of the best characters that I've ever encountered, written by Joe Abercrombie. But we also have Balthazar the Necromancer, who has a much longer, more lofty title. But I love nothing more in fantasy stories than a magician or sorcerer or spellcaster of some kind with enormous ambition, who's also just a complete and total misanthrope, who hates everybody. And Balthazar has his redeeming qualities, but he is power mad with ambition. And due to the binding that brings them all together for this mission, let's just say that he tries the hardest to weasel his way out of this. But ever since I read the character of Raistlin in the Dragonlance Chronicles back in the 80s, I've always loved characters that are kind of a mean-spirited but ultimately incredibly ambitious sorcerer, or in this, he's very specific. He's a magician, not a sorcerer, but I have a real soft spot for these kinds of characters. So I was probably rooting for Balthazar more than any other character over the course of the story, and the peak of his story arc is so satisfying. I would say he has the most satisfying conclusion to his story of all the characters, in my opinion. But we also have Sunny, an elf, and elves basically, like, kids burn effigies of elves in public and people cheer them on. Like, you know, it's a city, an environment where elves are persona non grata because, once again, there are hordes of them in the Holy Lands and they like to eat people. But Sunny is on this team, and she has a unique ability to turn invisible, which is very convenient for a team like this. And yeah, you will absolutely fall in love with Sunny before you reach the halfway point. You'll be rooting hard for her. Baron Rickard. It's basically Bela Lugosi, or pick your favorite vampire, because depending upon how recently he's fed, Baron Rickard's appearance and his power set kind of changes. But there's a very interesting twist on the vampire ability to charm people or influence people that's used for astonishing comedy throughout. But yeah, if you like vampires in any way, shape, or form, from movies, books, video games, whatever, Baron Ricard is going to absolutely blow your mind. And last but certainly not least, we have the Vigga Wolf, probably the most entertaining character ever created by Joe Abercrombie in terms of just laughs and violence and just great heroic beats. And she's a semi-tragic figure, but also just an incredibly heroic figure because she is a full-blown Viking werewolf. It's a little bit like the character of Logan Nine Fingers, or the Bloody Nine from the First Law series. In terms, he just loves Vikings. Like if you read any of Joe Abercrombie's books, all 9 of these books include mean, surly Vikings who are just completely indestructible. And what makes some of those battles even more interesting is when you have Viking on Viking. But he just has a real soft spot for these characters. So it would not be a Joe Abercrombie experience without some sort of Scandinavian badass hero who's really good at just burying battle axes in people's skulls. But she also happens to be a werewolf, and due to that, she has certain like dog-like qualities, like short-term memory problems, and also is very crude and brazen in her interest in strong drink and vigorous lovemaking on a regular basis. No, she actually reminds me a little bit as well of the character of Karlach and Baldur's Gate 3. Speaking of the fantasy genre being really strong right now, it wouldn't surprise me at all if Joe Abercrombie had at least dabbled in Baldur's Gate 3 at some point. I don't know if he's a gamer or not, but if you love lovable, kick-ass savage barbarians like Karlach or like the Bloody Nine from First Law, there's a strong chance that the Vigga Wolf might be your favorite character in this story. I just happen to be such a I don't know, just an easy mark for evil, corrupt spellcasters, but pound for pound entertainment value, Vigga Wolf definitely is the most entertaining character, I think, in the entire history of Joe Abercrombie's career. And if this is starting to sound like a supernatural fantasy version of like the Suicide Squad from the DCEU, you wouldn't be that far wrong. I mean, once again, these are the devils. They are assembled for certain missions, and if some of them die along the way, well, then the church will recruit new devils for the team, but they are there to do the jobs that need to be done kind of discreetly and in the shadows. And maybe Joe Abercrombie was self-consciously thinking as he wrote this, like I can sell this idea to Amazon or to Apple to say it's superheroes and fantasy coming together. Like the audience will eat it up. But what's cool about it, if you like superhero combat, during some of the battle sequences, different characters will square off, and whether that's like I said, like a pyromancer versus a necromancer, or a knight versus some sort of unholy abomination, it's interesting seeing which characters find each other in combat and kind of politely focus on that objective while ignoring everything else, which once again is a lot like reading like a Chris Claremont X-Men comic from the late 80s, where like Wolverine and Sabretooth, they go off and do their thing, and Professor X and Magneto, they'd have their battle over here, and it's very classic in that sense. So maybe some people will find that to be a little bit formulaic, but if you get off on that kind of combat, you will really enjoy the battle scenes. And I'd say there's probably 4 or 5 major battles throughout. I mean, once again, you can make a case that there are perhaps even too many battles because the battles just go on and on and on. And once again, I want the history, I want the lore, I want all that crap. But if you just want a fast-paced adventure story, you're going to be absolutely delighted. As far as like my final spoiler goes, maybe my biggest criticism, Joe Abercrombie loves to end his books on something of a tease or a cliffhanger to lead you along to the next book. And there is something resembling a tease in this book, but it wasn't nearly as provocative or enticing or earth-shattering as I was hoping for. When you've been on like a 700-page journey and you're getting close to the end, you want to really end on the most like colossal, lingering impression humanly possible. And I would argue that the climax for all the characters involved absolutely delivers on that front, even like above and beyond the Call of Duty. But the very last chapter, which introduces some new stories and some new characters, I was like, you know what? Maybe I'm just too attached to those other characters, but it's hard to get reinvested in a whole new cast of characters in a tease or an epilogue when it doesn't have a lot of connectivity to the rest of the story. But who knows? Maybe other people will feel differently. I was hoping for, once again, a final chapter where I'd be like, oh my fucking God! And I didn't quite get that experience. But I still got an excellent reading experience from start to finish. I'd say it took me maybe like 8 or 9 days to read it overall. I didn't want to just binge through it where I would retain nothing. I wanted to savor it. I wanted to like slow down and enjoy the experience. And I did, because in the end, this book made a lot of familiar things seem very fresh and new again. We've all experienced werewolf stories. We've all experienced vampire stories. We've all experienced stories with evil spellcasters that are trying to unlock certain abilities. But this book makes them all feel new again. And that's hard to do when you read a lot of fantasy or watch a lot of fantasy or play a lot of fantasy games. You've been there and done that and bought the T-shirt when it comes to different magic systems. And yet, Joe Abercrombie really came up with a fascinating, compelling, very detailed, nuanced depiction of magic that I think a lot of people are going to get really invested in. And some books go into that more than others, like R. Scott Baker with his Prince of Nothing series. He goes into almost mathematical detail in terms of how the different systems of magic work. And sometimes books are a little bit more vague and like, oh, they throw a lightning bolt and the enemy is fried and that's all you got to know. But if you like a little intellectual rigor, where there's like a difference between using magic with instinct versus using magic by studying a lot of forgotten tomes and that sort of thing. They're different disciplines that are fleshed out really, really well. Whether or not a spellcaster specializes in earth or air or frost or death or whatever the case might be. So that was awesome. But in the end, what's going to make or break this over the long term is the degree to which people get invested in these characters. And I think Joe Abercrombie absolutely outdid himself in coming up with a team of 6 to 7 really remarkable individuals, and we can debate which ones are our favorite. But I fucking love these characters, and I would love to see more of them in the years ahead. But I think at this point, I've said all I've got to say. Thank you, Joe Abercrombie, for giving me endless hours of enjoyment over the last couple of years with your previous 9 books that I read, and now this new one. And whatever you do next, I'll be reading it on day 1. And if people like this review and want to see me review more new fantasy books as they're coming out, there is a 3rd book by Jay Kristoff for this trilogy coming out in November, and I've got more than enough time to just start shamelessly emailing the shit out of their publicity departments and like, give me a copy of that goddamn book. I want to review it. But obviously, I want to review it in a timely fashion related to the release of that book. So, yeah, I might be doing some more cigar smoking of Hudson Barn books, reading fantasy books later this year. Once again, this channel is always going to be a movie channel, but I do love a good fantasy book, especially since so many of these fantasy books go on to become games, shows, movies, etc. It's all part of the same kind of entertainment ecosystem. And in the end, I guess this channel is just devoted to storytelling. The stories that I love dearly. And it was a pleasure and a privilege singing the praises of Joe Abercrombie for a few minutes on this channel. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. Hope everybody enjoys the book as much as I did. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.